Thanks very much for joining us today. I'm Dan Rundy. I'm a Senior Vice President at CSIS. I am thrilled to be hosting this virtual event on a really important book called We Win, They Lose. We have one of the authors online now, and another will be joining us shortly. My friend Dan Negrea, who is the Senior Director of the Freedom and Prosperity Center at the Atlantic Council, is one of the co-authors, along with Dr. Matthew Kroenig, who's a Vice President and Senior Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, also at the Atlantic Council. This is a really important book. This is about talking about the Republican Party and its foreign policy and what the future of the Republican Party's foreign policy looks like. And I think this is a topic of great interest to many people, whether we're talking about the war in Ukraine or the challenges to Israel, or the challenges in Latin America, or the challenges with, of course, with the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, and our challenge with Russia. There's any number of different challenges in front of us today, and I think the book is particularly timely. I love the book. I did an endorsement for the book, but a lot of folks bigger deals than me did much more important blurbs about it. Congressman Mike Gallagher, the chairman of the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, did an important blurb. My friend Robert O'Brien, the former National Security Advisor, did a blurb. The president and CEO of the Atlantic Council, Fred Kemp, did an important blurb. And then Walter Russell Mead, one of the great public intellectuals of our time, also did an important blurb for the book. So it's timely. I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about some of the questions I think many of us have about, well, what kind of foreign policy should we expect in the future from the Republican Party, from a future Republican president, from Congress with significant either majorities or significant minorities with the Republican Party present in them. So I think these are all important. This is an important moment for this book to have come out. So Dan, I'm thrilled to have you. Let's first talk about why did you all write this book?
Dan, thank you so much for having us. And we are sort of following in your footsteps. Your book, The American Imperative, came before our book. You are focusing on the soft power of the United States. It's important to us as well, but we also address hard power issues. The idea for the book was to have an early draft of the national security strategy for the next Republican administration. So rather than it being conceived in the inevitable chaos of every new administration, we wanted to have an outline well in advance. The other thing is something that you touched on. We are in a moment of great danger in international relations. Many thoughtful people, among them Robert Gates, former defense secretary, compares this time with the pre-World War II time, with the 1930s. And the question is, what kind of moment are we in? And we address this on the cover of the book, in the title. We start by saying that we need to win. We need to have a foreign policy aimed at winning. The title is We Win, They Lose, which is a Ronald Reagan line. But then we continue by saying it's a Republican foreign policy for the new Cold War. Not everybody accepts the concept that we are in a new Cold War. In the book, we made very emphatically the point that we are in a new Cold War. And then we explained that we are in a new Cold War against what we define as the new axis of evil. It's not just China, but it is also Russia, Iran, and North Korea. By the way, Heritage put out a paper, Carafano, Pillsbury, who wrote a great book on China entitled Winning the New Cold War. And so this idea is catching on, and I was very happy to see this weekend an interview with Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia, entitled The Fighter in the Cold War with China. So the concept that we are in a new Cold War is catching on. So then the question becomes, okay, so if we are in a Cold War, what are the guiding principles? And what we did in this book, what Matt Kroenig and I did in this book, was we identified three key guiding principles where the Republican principles introduced by Ronald Reagan and those of Donald Trump are in a fusion. So that's the other very important thing in this book. We believe that the Republican Party needs to be anchored in the truth, the principles introduced by Ronald Reagan, but then updated by Donald Trump. So these are peace through strength, moving from free trade to fair trade, and American exceptionalism. And what I found extraordinary in the interview with Australian Prime Minister Abbott, he talks about really the same three things. So he says at one point, quote, by doing everything to reduce our economic vulnerability, that's the free trade, not allowing China to lie, cheat, and steal in trade, increase our deterrent capability, and that's the peace through strength. And importantly, since then you love soft power, to regain the cultural self-confidence that was an important part of winning the Cold War. And this is what we call in our book, the American exceptionalism. So that's the framing for the book. That's where we started, and that's where we are going with it.
Yeah, as you know, in my book, I kind of duck and dodge this issue, and I published the book maybe more than a year ago now, and things have changed. Things, unfortunately, have gotten certainly colder. The temperature is more cold, not warm, and so maybe that, and so it sure feels as if we're in certainly a frosty moment at the very least. And so I've used the term great power competition, but I think I see it increasingly used. When I interviewed with Hugh Hewitt, when I released my book, and when I interviewed with former Speaker Newt Gingrich, and I think you all did a podcast with him as well, he said, Dan, both of them said, I read your book, I like your book. I disagree with you, Dan, because both of them said we think we're in a new Cold War. So I think the fact that you have it in the title. And I look at the quote from Congressman Gallagher. He uses the term new Cold War, Tony Abbott. I certainly think on the right, I think conservatives in particular are increasingly comfortable with this term. And so I do think that I think we're going to see it. Unfortunately, we certainly are moving in that direction at the very least. And so I think I guess the thing I would say is one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was, okay, how is it different than the previous Cold War? Why is it more dangerous, and why is it more complex than the previous Cold War? If we're in a second Cold War.
Well, I mean, the fact that the first Cold War was different from this one doesn't make the current one less of a Cold War. The Second World War was different from the First World War, but it was still a world war. Let me address something that I think is very, very important here, and I know it's, again, close to your heart. There are a lot of people who say this is not a Cold War because there isn't an ideological dimension to the conflict that we have with China, Russia, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I strongly disagree with that. I think that there is very much an ideological dimension. It's very clearly a contest between brutal, revisionist, expansionist dictatorships on the one hand, and the free world. And that's, by the way, another term from the previous Cold War that is coming back. The other thing I would like to point out, which is very important, is this. Again, there are some who argue that this is not a Cold War because in the previous Cold War, it was very clear. We had the center in Moscow, and then there are these countries referred to as satellites and so on. Right now, we still have a group of countries that even if they're not in an alliance, they are in an alignment or in an entente, and they are coordinating with each other. So there is a block of these authoritarian regimes that the free world is facing. The other thing where, again, there are parallels and differences from the previous Cold War is the emergence of another grouping of countries, again, just like last time, where we have the new acts of evil, we have the free world, and we have what many call the global south, but a grouping of countries that I prefer to call the new non-aligned movement. Countries that say, well, we recognize that what Russia did in Ukraine, the actions of Iran are problematic and so on, but we are neutral. We are not taking an action. We want to still trade with China. It's problematic because the violence caused to the principles of the United Nations, of international law in general, by the invasion of Ukraine, for example, were grave. But this group of countries choose not to take sides.
Dan, let me just take it. I know that, let me just do two things. One is tell this audience about your background, because I think it's relevant to this conversation. Just a little bit about how did you come to the United States? Because I think I think it's an important for our listeners to understand that.
Yeah, I was born in communist Romania, and I got a graduate degree in Romania and worked for the Ministry of Finance in international relations, working relations with the World Bank and the IMF. So I was in a communist government for 2 years before I defected to the United States in Washington when I came to World Bank and IMF meetings. So in looking at what China is doing right now, in looking at what North Korea is doing right now, countries that are run by communist parties, I feel I understand them. And I feel I understand also what Russia is doing, because why they are not run by the Communist Party. It's run by people who were trained in the communist era. They're all KGB officers at the top of Russia. So it's the same mentality, the same cynicism, the same lack of consideration for human life, for the good of the people in the service of these ideas that are abstract and highly noxious.
Sorry, just one other thing, if I may, Dan, if I could just, you chose to come here as opposed to other places in the world. Tell folks, why did you decide to come to the United States as opposed to, say, France or the UK or somewhere else?
Well, the great thing about America is you can come to America, and if you raise your hand, you wear allegiance to the Constitution, you're an American. Nobody can tell you that, you were not born here, color of your skin, religion, or anything else, ethnicity. That's the wonderful thing. But let me specify. Legally, coming legally, very important point. And I see Matt Kroenig was able to.
I see Matt Kroenig has joined. But I love that story, and it's so true. My wife, many friends and family who've done the same thing. So it's a thank you for sharing that story. So Matt, I know you also are joining us, and I know we wanted to make sure that we included you. You're the co-author of this fabulous book. Frank Lund said you need to repeat. Titles, We Win, They Lose. It says, we're not going to call on you yet, Matt. So we're going to wait for a minute, but I'm going to have, so I'll come back to you. I know you were still getting yourself set up, but here's a question. I think there are going to be many people in this audience, if they say, okay, this book is great. And Dan Rundy liked this book quite a lot, Dan Negrea, but there are going to be some people that say, well, there's a critique of the Trump administration that says, well, the Trump administration was, quote unquote, isolationist, or the Trump administration acted in a unilateral way, or the Trump administration, there were a variety of criticisms. Could you just I think that's sort of one of the elephants in the room, if you might, because I suspect it's probably one of the reasons you wrote this book. Because if I read this book, this says that you're arguing that you're arguing for an internationalist foreign policy for the next Republican president. And there are many critics of the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, said, well, that wasn't what we got. Now, what's your reaction to that criticism? Because I'm sure you may or may not get that explicitly, but that's kind of sort of out there. I'd be curious about what your reaction is to that.
So we were extraordinarily honored to have the foreword to the book written by former Secretary of State Pompeo. And I heard Mike Pompeo answer that question in a recent interview. And I thought the way he answered it was very smart, which was this. I can tell you all kinds of things about what former President Trump will do if he's president again. But the best thing that I can do is point to the things that he actually did. So this accusation of isolationism just don't stand up to scrutiny. So, for example, relations with Japan were very strong. The Quad was revitalized and strengthened during President Trump. There was a new deal cut with Korea, both economic deal and on military cooperation. What people point to on relations with allies, which is a very important point, is Trump's sharp criticism of our allies in Europe. And you know what? He was right. And this was it was criticism not because he wanted the NATO to be weaker. He wanted NATO to be stronger. He asked the European allies to live up to commitments that these sovereign countries made of their own free will at the 2014 Wales conference. After Russia invaded Ukraine the first time, they got together and they said, we absolutely positively have to spend 2% of our GDP for defense because look what Russia did. Guess what? They didn't. So President Trump came and said, hey, listen, guys, you need to live up to your commitments. As a result of that, about $400 billion more money came into strengthening NATO. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal to that effect. And he said, because President Trump insisted very vocally and threatened that if they don't live up to their commitments, the US may not live up to its commitment on Article 5, scare them into doing the right thing, so to speak. But that's not because he wanted to weaken NATO. He wanted to strengthen NATO.
Yeah, so this has been my take on this. I would argue generally with folks who are not predisposed to support President Trump, what I would say is one interpretation of many of his actions was to say, we would like to renegotiate the condo fees on global leadership. And we would like to understand, like, what are you doing on burden sharing, whether it's in security, whether it's on trade, whether it's on other issues. We would like to try and maintain largely the current agreement, the current order, but we'd like to have a renegotiation of the burden sharing. And certainly since the Eisenhower administration, through the Reagan administration, through the Trump administration, there were sustained criticisms of burden sharing on NATO security. And so the fact that during the Obama administration, they had all agreed to a 2% number and then not honored it, well, that's a problem. And I think we're seeing this now as well, where, I think this is an issue. So Matt, thanks for joining. I'm thrilled. I know you're overseas. I wanted to make sure that we had both of you, and that's why we're doing this virtually. And I'm glad you're able to join us. I want you to come. I want you to also address this question, which is one of the elephants in the room, Matt, is this. I love this book. I did a blurb for the book. I've read the book. I love this excellent book. But I would argue this book makes the case for an internationalist foreign policy. There are many critics that say, the Trump administration was isolationist, et cetera. Now, Dan has responded, but I wanted to give you a chance to add anything if you wanted to on this specific issue, because it seems to me that's one of the elephants in the room is like, well, if there's another Trump administration, there's going to be massive isolation. The United States is going to aggressively pull back from the world. I mean, I think that's the critique. What's your reaction to that, Matt Kroenig?
Yeah, well, Dan, first, thanks very much for having us on, and apologies to you and the others for being a bit late. I'm in Southeast Asia and was on a bus that was 90 minutes late. So, but glad I'm able to make it.
Well, you look great. You look fine, and the sound's working. So technology is amazing. So I'm glad you're with us.
Delighted to be here. And so on whether Trump is isolationist, I'd say just look at the first term. And, he used military force against General Soleimani in the Middle East, despite some of or maybe because of some of the tough rhetoric against NATO, as Dan was saying, strengthened NATO. Actually, the United States increased its spending for NATO under Trump. 2 new NATO allies entered during Trump. On Asia, made the tough decision to change economic relations with China, made personal visits to Asia to visit with Kim Jong-un. So if you just look at the first term, it wasn't isolationist. And I do think that part of the reason that people have this perception is because there are some out there who are maybe trying to define Trumpism as isolationism. And so I think that's one of the motivations that Dan and I wrote the book. And in fact, we say this in the introduction, is that we wanted to define what we think Trumpism is so that others don't poorly define it. As we argue in the book, he actually had much more in common with Reagan's approach to international affairs than many appreciate. So yes, it may be different than the George W. Bush years, but I think it is consistent with some of the traditions of republicanism.
Yeah, and then if I may add something on economic relations, Trump didn't get out of NAFTA. He renegotiated NAFTA and updated it, but NAFTA is functioning just great, and Mexico is our largest economic partner.
Right. I mean, they renegotiated NAFTA and called it USMCA, and so I think that's right. Let me go to, I think one of the other things that when people talk about a Trump foreign policy, there's quote unquote, there's concern about what kind of an approach a Trump administration would take to Russia. Could I ask each of you just to reflect on, if I said Russia, a second Trump administration, discuss, I also want you to, if you could each speak to, okay, Trump administration supporting the Ukrainian cause, discuss. So if you could take both those on, because it seems to me those are going to be, there's enormous concern in Washington that if there's a second Trump administration, a President Trump would, quote unquote, pull the plug on support for Ukraine, that somehow President Trump would have an overly friendly or too friendly set of relations with Russia, given sort of the behavior of Russia. That's not how you talk about it in the book. Talk about that, but let me start with you, Matt, and then I'll give you a chance, Dan, given that to respond to that, please.
Good. Well, first, again, let's go back and look at what Trump actually did when he was in office. And when he was in office, he had a foreign policy that was pretty good for Europeans, pretty good for the Ukrainians, and pretty tough on Russia. Unlike the Obama administration, he was willing to provide lethal aid to the Ukrainians. Again, he increased defense spending on NATO, moved U.S. forces forward into Poland, so started the permanent presence in Poland, killed Russian mercenaries on the ground in Syria, used military force against Assad, Russia's ally, after Assad used chemical weapons, built 2 new nuclear weapons with the purpose of deterring Russia, 2 new low-yield nuclear weapons. So I think if you just look at the results of the foreign policy in the first term, pretty tough on Russia, maybe the toughest president against Russia since the end of the Cold War. And so what would they do going forward on Ukraine? And it's hard to know. But if you just look at Trump's statements, he hasn't said he'd abandon Ukraine. Just a couple of days ago, with Mike Johnson, he said that he'd support a loan to Ukraine. He also said that, yes, he does want to stop the killing. He wants to bring the war to a close. But that he said part of the way he would do that is go to Putin and say, Putin, if you don't negotiate, I'm going to give Zelensky more than he's ever got. So I think it's possible that Trump actually ends up providing more aid to Ukraine than the Biden administration did. Again, I think that there are people trying to define Trump in certain ways, but if you look at his actions and his statements, I think there's not any reason to believe he's going to abandon Ukraine or roll over to Putin.
Let me just interject, and I'd love to hear from Dan on this. So I wrote a piece in Newsmax, which is a website that Republicans read, like, of course, I could write this in CNN or I could write this in NPR, and none of the people who I want to read it would read it. But I purposely wrote it in Newsmax saying we need a lend-lease for Ukraine, not necessarily a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. We need a lend-lease for Ukraine. So do you know in what year the British government paid back their lend-lease and Marshall Plan loans to the United States after World War II? They paid it back in 2006. So that's, I don't know, what's that, 70 years? So they paid it back 70 years later. So if we said to Ukraine, you have 70 years to pay back your loan, you have a 10-year grace period after conflict ends, and we'll charge you 0.5%. The World Bank, Dan, as you know, has special sweetheart deal loans for the world's poorest countries called IDA loans. I think those things are lent out at like 0.5% or something. It's less than 1% at most. So we said 0.5% interest, 10-year grace period, and you can pay us back in 60 years. They could do that. That's in essence what the Brits did for Lend-Lease. So I would argue we need a Lend-Lease for Ukraine. The other thing, I agree with you, Matt. What's interesting is when I listen to President Trump's statements on Ukraine, he has said, we use all these think tank terms in Washington, but basically he's going to tie more Ukraine support to efforts on collective security in Europe, which is a mouthful, but basically it's the point Dan was making earlier, like, okay, people, who's in or who's out on 2%? And of the 27 or 28 members, you guys can tell me how many members there are in NATO. Is it 27 or 28? How many are doing 2%? I love Canada. Canada's not doing 2%. I got knighted by the Spanish government, guys. I love Spain. They're doing like 0.9 or 1.1% or something bad. I think the Germans, like just 20 minutes ago, got to 2% for the first time. Come on, people. So like my view is like, I think he's sort of saying, you wanted me to give more aid to Ukraine. Tell me what you're doing on NATO and we can have a conversation. Now, that's not what our friends in Europe say. They say, well, I want to talk about burden sharing, but I don't want to talk about the NATO part. I want to talk about how many refugees I'm hosting. That's great. Thumbs up. Let me tell you about how we're accelerating EU accession to Ukraine. Great. Thumbs up. I'm in favor of that. I think what he's saying, and I think we should use it as leverage to our Europeans, that you want more U.S. assistance on Ukraine, show up for us on NATO. So I actually think it's pretty clever, but a way he's being described or defined isn't the way we're talking about it. If I read the newspaper, I listen to a lot of our peers in the foreign policy community, they're not talking in this way about it, or they're not seeming to be, my guess, maybe I'm being charitable, but it's almost as if they're not listening to what he's saying. And so I think, so Dan, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. Russia, Ukraine, Trump administration, what's your take on this, Dan?
Yeah, I think I very much appreciate, Dan, that you are bringing the conversation on this topic. We see this a lot in the press. Trump likes dictators, is nice to dictators. It's just factually not true. He has a negotiating style where he flatters the person who is on the other side of the table because he believes that that's a more efficient way to get to an agreement. But he can flatter them and then be hard on them when negotiating. So staying on Russia for a second, Trump was against Nord Stream 2. Which was a very important deal for...
Sorry, Dan, what is Nord Stream 2 for our television listeners out there?
Nord Stream 2 is a pipeline that was going from Russia to Germany, transporting natural gas. And Germany's economy depended in a major geostrategic miscalculation, depended on cheap energy from Russia. And Trump was very clear in discussions with Angela Merkel that dependence on the dictatorial regime in Russia is imprudent, and sanctioned firms involved in building Nord Stream 2 against the wishes of the Germans and with the Russians screaming. And guess what? He was right. And then when President Biden became president, he lifted the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, only to reverse himself a year later. So he lifted them in 21, and then when Putin invaded in 22 the second time, he reimposed them. The other thing that Trump did is he closed the Russian consulate in Seattle and sent back 60 Russian diplomats. I mean, these are not the actions of someone who likes dictators, admires Putin, etc. And then let's look at all.
Let me just say something else. Like if you admire Putin, you'd want to have a price of oil at $100 a barrel, because these thug regimes, Iran, Venezuela, and Russia, all have some price of oil. I don't know. You tell me, like $70 a barrel is what they need to finance their army and their secret police and like giving out stuff to buy off different parts of their society. What we want is to have $20 a barrel oil to bankrupt the Russians, bankrupt the Iranians, and bankrupt the Venezuelans, right? And I think his policy of saying let's produce more oil and gas in the United States and make sure that we're an energy superpower, the term he used, is a way to break the back of the bad guys. We absolutely should be doing that. You know who said this? The top advisor to Zelensky said last week or 10 days ago on the Wall Street Journal, we need to get to 20, we need to crash the price of oil so we bankrupt the Russians. Hell yeah, I agree with that. So I think the first Trump administration wasn't in favor of that. We should not have $70, $80, $90, $100 barrel oil because it's financing these thug regimes. So like if you're in favor of a thug regime, you would say, if you were in favor of a thug regime, you'd say, I won't provide lethal aid. If you're in favor of a thug regime, you'll, won't produce more oil and gas. If you're in favor of a thug regime, you won't tell your allies, you sure as hell better get to 2% on NATO. Well, these are all things the Trump administration did. So I do think there's a mismatch between how he's described and how he's okay. So, but you both agree. Let me just push you, Dan, on this. If President Trump wins, is he going to pull the plug on Ukraine aid? Do you believe he would pull the plug on Ukraine aid? Because that's the critique.
So I wrote an article with General Keith Kellogg who was Vice President Pence's national security advisor, and he is currently an advisor to President Trump. And the elements, what we articulated there was what would be the elements of a Trump proposed solution to the Ukraine conflict. And as Matt pointed out earlier, number one, it would be Trump will use peace through strength in negotiating with Putin and say, we are prepared to arm Ukraine with long-range weapons that would really hurt you, so you better cut a deal. And then he will go to Zelensky, and this is based on snippets that Trump said at one point or another in interviews or speeches. And then he will go to Ukraine, to the Ukrainians, and say, you have to cut a deal, which means that the territory currently occupied by the Russians will stay under Russian control for some time. But then comes a key element that we stated in the article. There will be security guarantees from the United States and most likely key European nations and maybe non-European nations, security guarantees to the Ukrainians who are giving up control over part of their territory, not giving it up permanently, but giving up temporary control in exchange for security guarantees so they can stop the killing. Matt, I'm sure you have points you want to make.
So let me just push on that. So Matt, could you imagine a scenario in some kind of a peace deal for Ukraine that the United States, even under a Trump administration, would accept Ukraine joining NATO or having a pathway to join NATO over time?
I think so. And, Trump hasn't gone into a lot of detail about what his Ukraine strategy would be, but you have people like Dan and me working on pieces. And so I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal with Steve Hadley, where we argued essentially the kind of Reaganite strategy that he and I had both advocated for 2 years ago of giving Ukraine everything it needs to win a decisive battlefield victory. Should be, what should have been the goal 2 years ago. Unfortunately, Biden didn't provide Ukraine with the aid that it needed. Russia has had time to dig in. New technology like drones seems to be favoring the defense. So it doesn't seem likely to us that either side is going to make major moves in terms of offensives or counteroffensives And so we recommended that we aid Ukraine, but with the goal of trying to wind down the conflict along the current lines that could provide the breathing space to bring Ukraine into NATO and into the EU. And then, like we did with West Germany, over time work diplomatically to reclaim the rest of Ukraine's territory. So I think that kind of strategy, very similar to what Dan and Keith Kellogg advocated for, and I think would be consistent with everything Trump has said so far.
Okay, so I'm sorry to harp on this, but there's so much of the critique of Trump has been that he's pro-dictator, Russia curious, going to sell out the Ukrainians. I'm hearing both of you say, and I'm saying I don't believe that. And you guys agree with that? Is that correct?
That's correct.
If he were pro-dictator, he wouldn't threaten to put 100% tariffs on Chinese cars.
So I also think we could spend the whole conversation about the legacy of what the Trump administration did on China. I would argue one of the most important things he did, and you've referred to it, I think, Dan, earlier in your comments, is he changed the conversation on China. If you look at where we were in 2016 to where we are today, he has moved the Overton window. Okay, that's like a fancy think tank term that you guys both know. It basically like shifted the terms of debate that are acceptable to say that like that has fully shifted. If you look at the policies that the Biden administration has followed through on China, I have a very hard time even if I squint really hard, I don't see a lot of daylight between the Biden administration's done with China and the Trump administration's done on China. Do you guys agree with that? That there's in essence become a bipartisan? You agree with that, Dan? Matt, do you agree with that?
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no, your turn. I spoke too much already before you got here.
Okay, well, Dan, I would say you're right on economic policy, that Biden has left Trump's economic policy in place with regard to China, the tariffs, and the other, and efforts to secure supply chains. I do worry that the United States in the past couple of years has strayed from the peace through strength approach with China, though. We talk a big game about Taiwan being the #1 scenario for the Department of Defense. But then if you look at defense spending, we're actually cutting defense spending or close to it when you take into account inflation. And I think that's a problem. We need to also have the military forces to deter China. And I would be hopeful that a Trump administration would put its money where its mouth is and make those investments on the defense side as well. So yes, the economic policy has been consistent, but I think some other parts have maybe weakened America's competitive stance against China.
Okay, so this book that we're talking about is called We Win, They Lose. The authors are Matt Kroenig and Dan Negrea. I love the book. You got to go out and buy it retail. This is an important book. It's about the future of Republican foreign policy is in a Trump administration or beyond. They argue for an internationalist, an updated internationalist foreign policy for the United States, which I'm 100% on board with. Let me shift gears because we could talk, like I said, we could talk about China the whole time. Let me make one comment about China, and then I want to talk about a couple other topics. So I would argue that we have now, largely because of President Trump, we have a bipartisan consensus that we have a problem with the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, and we have a bipartisan consensus about Vladimir Putin's murderous regime. I think that we have a problem with that. What I don't think we currently have yet, and I think this book helps a bit, and I think that the select committee on the Chinese Communist Party that Mike Gallagher has been leading, and Chairman Gallagher on Thursday is going to speak at CSIS. He's going to give his last speech as chairman of the committee at CSIS. I'm really happy. He turned down 12 invites from CSIS. He said yes to mine, so the 13th is the charm. And maybe it's because I have a relationship with him, but maybe not. But and I'm not too proud to beg. But the point is, I would argue we don't have yet a bipartisan consensus about what the hell to do about these two problems. And so I think the select committee has helped us move in that direction. The reason I wrote my book, The American Empire, was to move us in that direction. I think your book helps us in that conversation as well. I think we have not yet fully formed what are we going to do about all this? There's a defense component, there's a trade component, there's a values component, there's an economic component, there's an energy component. So many things you talk about in the book kind of move us, I think, in that direction. and that's why I think that your book is so important, because I don't think we yet have a full consensus among Republicans and Democrats of what to do about this. So I think it's important that we first signal to our friends in the Democratic Party that we should be able to form a bipartisan consensus about what the hell to do about this. So I think your book helps on that. So that's a comment more than if you guys want to comment on my comment, I'd welcome that. Do you guys agree with that we have a consensus that we all recognize as a problem? I don't think we've yet fully formed, like, what are we going to do about it for the next 10, 20 years? I don't think that's been fully cooked yet. And that's one of the reasons we have a full employment program at think tanks like the Atlantic Council or CSIS. What are your reactions?
Oh, by the way, thank you for mentioning think tank. What I forgot to do is the disclaimer. So both Matt and I are responsible for centers at the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is a bipartisan, nonpartisan institution, and this is a partisan book. So the points of view we are expressing are ours and not necessarily those of the Atlantic Council.
Yeah, CSIS is the same. I think everyone knows I'm an out Republican, but I work at a nonpartisan / bipartisan institution that doesn't necessarily subscribe to every position that I take or I write about, but tolerates my views and allows me to do my work, and for which I'm grateful. So
let me make one of my favorite points in discussions with thoughtful people like you about our book, which is this. The reason why it's important to refer to a Cold War, a new Cold War, is because if we accept this premise, then we need to evaluate in a sober, very rational, very serious way what our priorities are. So what is the existential threat to the United States at this point? Is it climate change, the way some progressives argue and President Biden argues, or is it China? If we are in a Cold War, is it tolerable that, for example, looking at Chinese citizens of military age, that the number of Chinese citizens of military age crossing our southern border increased from 200 in 21 to 20,000 in the last fiscal year. And since October, there have been another 20,000. Try to imagine Soviet citizens coming into the United States by the tens of thousands during the previous Cold War. And then what do we do about terrorism? If we are in a Cold War, is it tolerable to have basically an open border so terrorists may come into the United States? And then, of course, we have energy. Should we have the ability to export LNG the way we were able to before? So these are important questions that come from this Cold War framing. And then coming to your point, if we accept the Cold War framing, then we can have bipartisan consensus on what we should do. Because in the previous Cold War, there was a lot of bipartisan consensus. But since then, in good times, no major threat to the safety of the United States, the bipartisan consensus goes away.
Matt, what's your take on this?
Well, Dan, I agree that I think you're right. There's a bipartisan consensus about the problem, and you're right that the consensus is that it's a multidimensional problem: economics, technology, military. And I also think you're right that even though we're taking steps, that we don't yet have a bipartisan strategy. And I think a good strategy starts with a clear goal. What are we trying to achieve? And this has been one of my hobbies in Washington the past few years, asking people, what is the goal of our China policy? And I can't get a clear answer from people. Some people say, well, it's avoiding war. And I say, okay, so China dominates the world and it becomes autocratic, but we avoid war. Is that success? They say no.
Hell no.
Others,
that's terrible. God almighty, that's the worst.
Yeah, that's the worst. Others have said, well, there's always competition. We're just always going to compete. I don't think that's the right answer either. No. I mean, Carthage and Rome aren't competing anymore. It's going to come to an end.
How about we bankrupt them and they have the democratic oomph of Portugal? And I love Portugal. They run out of people. They bankrupt themselves. Their house of cards economy collapses. I'm wishing they have a good old financial crisis. I don't wish them well at all. And that they don't have the oomph or the ability to threaten anybody. And they've got, they have like how about a lost 2 decades? Not one lost decade. How about 2 lost decades? That's my goal. And then that they can't copy their way into like technological dominance, and they can't run some exportable authoritarian, dystopian nightmare to thug regimes all over the world. That'd be my goal. I don't know. So I like we win, they lose. One of the reasons I want you guys on is like, I'm with you guys. Let's beat them. They should lose and we should win. I'd like another 100 years, please, of like expanding prosperity and expanding human freedom led by the West. I mean, come on, let's be honest. Like so think about, this is the thought exercise I do, Matt, is think about a world. I've done 100 speeches for my book. I said, what does a world look like led by the Chinese Communist Party, Vladimir Putin's thug regime, and the Star Wars bar of loser countries? Like Iran's a loser country, but led by these mullahs, this thug regime in North Korea, this thug regime in Venezuela, this thug regime in Cuba and Nicaragua, all thug losers. This is the Star Wars bar of countries. Think about if they got to set the global rules of the game: economic stability, human rights, peace in our time, laws and rules of trade, etc. And I said, think about the things you most care about: environmental stewardship. How about human rights and the kind of the rights you have as a person? These are young people making super duper personal choices about your life. Do you think they'd be better stewards of those choices than the West? Because that's what they're making a play for. They're making a play for that. They don't want to just be like on par with us and have some duality, whatever. They want to be head dog, and they're and their loser friends want to set the rules of the game. And if you did a thought experience and what a horrible world that would be, you're like, I don't want that, right? But I don't think people kind of think through like what the game they're playing is. They're straight up making a play to not only run the world and set the world order, all the think tank terms we use, but if you thought through what that meant for us on a day-to-day basis and our kids, you'd be appalled. It's disgusting. It's offensive. It's outrageous. Tell me I'm wrong, guys.
No, I completely agree, Dan. I think that foresight thinking is important because people often look at the 2 steps ahead. But yeah, think out decades. What kind of world do we want to live in? And is it a world dominated by the United States and its allies in the free world, or is it one dominated by these revisionist autocracies? And so that's why we think that the term "New Cold War" is appropriate, because some people challenged and said, well, it's different than the first Cold War. Sure, the first Cold War and the second Cold War were different. But this is just like the first Cold War. It's a contest between the United States and its allies in the free world against revisionist dictatorships for who's going to set the terms of global order. And you're absolutely right. Everybody in the free world has a stake in this competition, and we better hope that the free world prevails again.
So I love the support for our arguments in this article by former Australian Prime Minister Abbott. When Australia asked for an investigation of what Abbott calls the Wuhan virus, the response from the Chinese embassy was to say, we will start a trade war that will affect billions of dollars, $20 billion worth of Australian trade, unless you agree to the following demands, 14 demands: ending the U.S., ending Australia's alliance with America, permit all Chinese investments, no restrictions whatsoever, and my favorite, cease all criticism of the Chinese government. Now imagine that, a censorship on a sovereign nation from the Chinese. So then to your question, Pax Americana or Pax Sinica, very big difference, and we need to strain all our resources to achieve a Pax Americana.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I don't think this kind of thought through. There's lots of like, oh, we'll have some. Yeah, so I think this is really great. Let me turn to something else. So I think unfortunately, so I believe in democracy and supporting democracy in the world, and I support human rights in the world. And unfortunately, this is my view. that I think the term human rights has been co-opted by the left. So there are people, I think, who are in the Trump administration or people who are conservative. If I say human rights, so they kind of like recoil and like get their claws come out. And I'll say, well, okay, I'm a Catholic. I'm concerned about the rights of Christians in the Middle East. My wife and I have supported groups that support Christians that are being oppressed in the Middle East. I care about Cuban human rights. I care about the crushing of the Catholic Church in Nicaragua. I care about what's happening in Venezuela. I care about the Uyghurs. I care about democracy in Russia. I care about how Christians in Russian-occupied Ukraine are treated. These are all technically human rights issues, but because the term human rights has been hijacked, or let's use a nicer word, co-opted, there's been sort of, I want to call it almost like a ceding of the space. You talk you have make reference to democracy and human rights. I want you each to talk about, if I said democracy, human rights in a second Trump administration, the facile critique is like, oh, it's going to be terrible, anti-democracy, human rights is going to be the worst. Could I ask, I think you guys know what I'm talking about. So could I ask each of you to respond to that, please?
Matt?
Sure. Well, if you look at, I think Trump himself that didn't say a lot on this topic, but if you look at the people who served in his administration, they did. Mike Pompeo, who may be back in a second Trump administration, was a strong supporter of religious freedom in his State Department and of democracy and human rights. He even talked about creating an alliance of democracy. Other officials in the Trump administration as well. And in our book, Dan and I say that this is important to recognize, that you have some, realist analysts who say this isn't about ideology. It's just the United States and China, great powers duking it out. And in the book, we argue that no, this is an ideological competition, whether we like it or not, because she is making it an ideological competition. If we want to be realists about this, we have to be real and recognize that the threats that China pose stem from its from its communist system. If China were a liberal democracy, it wouldn't be systematically cheating on the international trading system, threatening its.
Can I just ask you a leading question, Matt? Is communism an evil system? Do you agree with that premise?
Yes.
Thank you. Dan Negrea, what do you think of communism? Is communism an inherently evil and deeply awful system?
That's why I defected. So, yeah.
Okay, sorry to ask a blatantly obvious question, but sometimes we have these think tank conversations, and I think we need to start with the obvious. So what you're saying, Matt, is their evil regime leads to a whole series of other things, including their horrible foreign policy and how they treat people both in their own country and around the world, right? So this stuff does matter, right?
That's right. And then on the other side of it, the fact that we are a democracy and stand for values bigger than ourselves is one of our greatest strengths in this competition. And so if we go to the Europeans and say, hey, we and China are two great powers duking it out, join our side, what's in it for them? If we say, no, this is about values, about human rights, about our shared values, join our side, that's a much more compelling argument to many around the world and one of our competitive advantages.
Yeah, so Dan, human rights, democracy, what's your take on this, Dan Negrea?
Human rights and democracy, we need to make a point unabashedly, unapologetically, that our system is superior to the system in communist China, communist North Korea, kleptocratic, thuggish Russian regime, and theocratic regime in Iran. Having said that, it is very important also that administrations in the United States make the case that America is a good country. So it is, if the progressives describe the United States as a country that is sexist, xenophobic, doesn't care about its flawed history about slavery, doesn't care about climate change, stresses real and perceived flaws of the United States, then we have a problem also mobilizing our society in fighting these dangerous adversaries overseas. So, for example, if we tell our young men and women in uniform, fight for the United States, possibly putting your life at risk, but our country is so terribly flawed, why would they do that? So we need to start by recognizing that America has been a force for good in the world, and what the flaws are vastly compensated by the good that America has done and represents.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our hour. You could tell I was I read the book. I love the book. I want to give you guys each a minute of kind of closing thoughts about what you want. I want people to go out and buy the book, We Win, They Lose by Dan Negrea and Matt Kroenig. And I think this is an important book, and I think it's worth going out and buying and reading. But I want to give you each a minute for kind of closing thoughts. So let me start with you, Dan Negrea. I'll give you a minute, and I'll give Matt Kroenig 2 since he came late, and he can kind of close this out. So Dan, you got a minute, and Mr. Kroenig, Dr. Kroenig gets 2.
I think that the most important message for me is that in this moment of extraordinary danger in international relations, it is important to be clear-eyed about the grave threats facing the United States. And what we provide in the book is a strategy to mobilize all the tools of American statecraft. And that includes military, economic, diplomacy, but very importantly, ideas, stressing that America should and deserves to lead the free world in opposing these adversaries. And we show how we should mobilize these resources in a whole of society effort to win in the contest that we are facing right now.
Okay, Matt, close us out.
Well, I'll start with the title of the book. Go back to that, We Win, They Lose, because the period we're in now is in many ways similar to the period when Reagan took office. So in the 1970s, there was this sense that the United States is in decline, the Soviet Union is a rising power, and the best that we could do was lock in parity and stabilize the relationship in a series of arms control agreements. Détente was the idea. And Reagan didn't buy it. He thought, one, that kind of meant a moral equivalence between the Soviet Empire and its captured nations and the United States and the free world. But two, he understood that we have inherent strengths, they have fundamental weaknesses, and if we took the gloves off and forced them to compete, that we could prevail. And he pursued that clear strategic vision and won the first Cold War. And I think we're in a similar period today. Many people think the United States is in decline. They're wrong. They talk about China as a rising power. They're wrong. They think the best that we can do is manage this competition, aim for some kind of new détente. That's wrong. Just like in Reagan's time, it would be an unacceptable moral equivalence to say that we're just going to manage this competition. And it would fail to recognize that we have real strengths. The Chinese Communist Party has real weaknesses. Let's take the gloves off. Let's force them to compete. And once again, the free world will win, and these revisionist autocracies will lose.
Amen. I totally agree. Thank you, Matt. Thanks, Dan. Okay, so everyone's got to go out and buy this. We Win, They Lose, Matt Kroenig and Dan Negrea. I love the book. Please go out and buy it. This is an important book. And thanks, gentlemen, for joining us today. I'm so pleased we were able to do this.
Very grateful, Dan. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thanks, folks.
Such a pleasure. Thanks, Dan.